إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our gathering and to make it benefiting for all of us and to give us all ikhlas, sincerity, and to make us among those who truly follow the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. As you heard the title of the topic, which is developing real men or having the manliness, but not according to what people think it is, but rather according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, the way the real men that became example to those who came after them were upon. And they are the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and the Tabi'een and those who followed them with ihsan. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to follow them, He commanded us to follow them in every matter. والسابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه. There's three categories of people that Allah is pleased with and they are pleased with Allah. The foremost from the Muhajirin and the people of Al-Ansar, the Medina, and وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُمْ, and those who followed them with ihsan, with goodness. And this is the real characteristics of men. When they do whatever they do it with ihsan. They do it with goodness. They do it with azima, with determination, with conviction, with certainty. And that's why the word is not just, as many people might think, al-rujula or al-rijal, as it's mentioned in the Quran. We talked about that earlier. There are other words that you would find in the nusus and the text, because that's what we need to follow and to understand. And just mentioning some of the points here, otherwise the detail of this is the ilm of the deen of Islam. Whoever wants to really develop himself to be a real man the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with is by following the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. But as mentioned, there is sometimes the words al-futuwa is mentioned in Arabic, and this is where in Surah Al-Kahf, where we recite in Yawm al-Jumu'ah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He praised the young people of the cave, إِنَّهُمْ فِتْيَةٌ آمَنُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ. They are fitya. Fitya usually translated as young men. But yes, this is what it means. But the significance of mentioning fitya, as the ulama they say, that means that age when they are young and strong and they're given the means to have the strong determination to do what is right, which is something that used to be the norm at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the early generations of Islam. That's why Umar radiallahu anhu, he used to take the opinions of those who are young. Why? Because of their sharp understanding of things. But they were raised to be men once they reach the age of puberty. So, but the point here is whether it's the word al-futuwa, and the ulama talked about al-futuwa. Al-futuwa, also one of the words that get abused nowadays by many of those who would, they heard this word before. They use it in fighting and things like this. This is not what it means. That's why you would find the definition of the ulama of al-futuwa, the strength that a person would have. Some of them would say, for example, as-safh an al-ikhwan, to pardon your brothers. This is futuwa. This is the real manhood, is when you pardon. When you have the ability not to pardon, when you have the ability not to forgive, you have the ability to revenge, you have the ability to, you have the means, you have the power, you're secure from being punished, right? But then you would choose to forgive, you would choose to pardon. This is futuwa. And many other things that the ulama talked about extensively, just about that word. Sometimes it's mentioned the word al-muru'ah. Al-muru'ah, oftentimes it's translated as nobility, manliness. To have muru'ah, which makes the person always zealing what is high level of things, whether it's manners, actions, always doing what is best. And one of which is, of course, the akhlaq and the dealing with others. And it comes from al-mar. Al-mar is the human being or the man. So these types of words, and that's why even the ulama of the hadith, they would not take the hadith of someone that he did some of the things that min khawarim al-muru'ah, something that would break his muru'ah. And this is not something that you would have it very well established with text. You know, it's something that is the urf, the norm has a big say in it. But for example, if someone in the norm, they would do something that is not according to the nobles or the nobility, not nobles in a rank of a society, but it's against the nobility of manners, for example. You cannot put it necessarily in the category of haram, but they would elevate themselves above what is be looked down upon or humiliation or things like this. So there's so many different things with that, but first, as mentioned before, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran al-insan, the human being, and many of the characteristics of the human beings, one of which is ظلوم and jahula, inna al-insana la kafur. The human being is kafur, is ungrateful. ويدعو الإنسان بالشر دعاءه بالخير وكان الإنسان عجولا. Human beings are in haste, and sometimes they make even dua against themselves with matters of evil. وإذا أنعمنا على الإنسان أعرض ونأى بجانبه وإذا مسه الشر كان يئوسا. If we bestow our favors upon the human being, أعرض, he would turn away and he take his side, and he turns with his side away, not acknowledging the favors of Allah. And وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ كَانَ يَئُوسًا. And if harm afflicts him, he becomes يَئُوسًا, given up. And this is all the negative characteristics of the human beings when they have it, and they have to work on it to elevate themselves from this degrading level of just being in the human race. That's not sufficient to be human, but rather a person, from the physical sense, a person has to develop himself to be abd to Allah, to develop the characteristics of someone that is a good human being, someone that is having the proper ubudiyah to Allah, the proper akhlaq with the people and things like this. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also said about the human beings, وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ أَكْثَرَ شَيْءٍ جَدَلًا. The human beings, they are the most thing in argumentative. They always argues and things like this, and as a result of kibr, arrogance, they want to defeat others, not for the sake of seeking the truth, but they want to defeat others. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the human beings, that they are weak. وَلَئِنْ أَذَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنَّا رَحْمَةً ثُمَّ نَزَعْنَاهَا مِنْهُ إِنَّهُ لَيَئُوسٌ كَفُورٌ وَلَئِنْ أَذَقْنَاهُ نَعْمَاءَ بَعْدَ ضَرَّاءَ مَسَّتْهُ لَيَقُولَنَّ ذَهَبَ السَّيِّئَاتُ عَنِّي إِنَّهُ لَفَرِحٌ فَخُورٌ. This is al-insan is mentioned, the human race. This is how human beings are. This is how we are. If we leave ourselves like this without developing ourselves, that is, if rahmah, if mercy, the human being is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them mercy to taste, and then it's taken away from them, إِنَّهُ لَيَئُوسٌ كَفُورٌ. He gives up, he becomes in state of disparity, he becomes ungrateful to Allah. And then وَلَئِنْ أَذَقْنَاهُ نَعْمَاءَ بَعْدَ ضَرَّاءَ. Then if the matter is the other way around, favors of Allah after hardship that he was going through, لَيَقُولَنَّ ذَهَبَ السَّيِّئَاتُ عَنِّي. He would forget the favors of Allah. He would say, now I got it from my own cleverness and my smartness and things like this. And he would forget about the favors of Allah. إِنَّهُ لَفَرِحٌ فَخُورٌ. Farih, that he rejoices in the wrong way, arrogantly forgets about the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the like of this is mentioned. But then when rijal is mentioned, it was not mentioned as males versus females. But in some of the verses of the Quran talks about men, those who would establish the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that's the purpose of life. So this is how the real development of a human being when it comes to men is to fulfill the commands of Allah, and also for the women to fulfill the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the Masjid Quba, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the men there when he said فيه رجال يحبون أن يتطهروا. There in it are men, those who would love to purify themselves. For the man to love to be pure, this is a sign of manliness. This is a sign of being rajul, someone that is responsible. And this is what it means really. It's not about having arrogance against others, as again people might take this word and think of it, or acting in a foolish way or things of that nature, but rather is to have the best character and the best manners, and one of which is to be so much concerned about tahara, the tahara of the inside and the tahara physically. So the heart is always in state of purity, purifying one's heart when it comes to his ibadah to Allah with ikhlas, with sincerity, when it comes to dealing with others, when it comes to the physical tahara, the physical purification for the person to establish the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we heard earlier today with the ayah of في بيوت أذن الله أن ترفع ويذكر فيها اسمه يسبح له فيها بالغدو والأصال رجال. The masajid is occupied by رجال men لا تلهيهم تجارة ولا بيع عن ذكر الله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة يخافون يوما تتقلب فيه القلوب والأبصار. There are men, trade and buying and selling does not divert them away from the dhikr of Allah. This is the sign of manhood in manhood in the deen of Islam. These are the characteristics of the men that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with. They are tested with things. They put forward their reason before their desire. And this is how the matter is. When someone always follows his desire, this is more towards childhood time of living, right? The children, this is what the children are upon, and we cannot blame them, right? They have desires, so you're not supposed to burden them with having to choose things based on reason more than their desires. No, your job as a parent with the tarbiyah to prevent them from anything that is harmful for them and to get them to be used to what is good. But they're children. But what is the difference between a child and someone that reached the age of being a man or being a responsible person? That he would put forward reason before one's desire. And these are the men that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. They would choose to come to the salah and they would leave the trade and the business and so on. Why? Because this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to do. So desire versus the haqq, the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered them to be upon. And they establish the salah, and they give the zakah, and they fear the day of judgment, and they fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned their truthfulness. The liar is a coward, and being a coward is not one of the characteristics of being a real man, right? And this is how we also we need to raise our children. Lying is something that al-mu'min la yakdhib, as the Prophet ﷺ said, the believer do not lie. That's why this is one of the things that even the early generations of Islam would make sure it is never accepted even from a child, even when he's not responsible for his actions. Lying is something that they would never allow them to get into this issue of lying. And the Prophet ﷺ in some of the texts would say that he would not speak to the ones in the household if they say a lie for some time. Why? To get the message across that this is not something that is acceptable whatsoever. So من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. From the believers, those who are صدقوا, they were truthful in what they had the covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and some of them died, some of them waiting. وما بدلوا تبديلا, they did not change, they don't change, they keep on they don't change and give themselves different colors, because this is the characteristics of the cowards. But rather they are firm upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from them. They're brave in fulfilling the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're kind to others, and knowing that the consequences of things is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the owner of all things, provisions, every matter. And that's why the real brave person is the one that is always honest and truthful, not the one that would try to lie to protect himself and things of that nature. Also, as it's mentioned in the Quran, when it comes to the times of need, when the people are in dire need, you would find the real men there to help. As Musa alayhi salam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him for Bani Israel to go fight their enemies and to liberate Jerusalem from the evil ones. And they said, إن فيها قوما جبارين وإنا لن ندخلها حتى يخرجوا منها فإن يخرجوا منها فإن داخلون. They were raised upon الذلة, humiliation. They were humiliated, and a generation raised in state of humiliation. They're not used to have this strength in their own selves and nobility. And to remove this humility from them, So they said, these people are strong and we cannot fight them. And they even said to Musa alayhi salam, اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا إنها هنا قاعدون. You and your Lord go fight. We're staying right here. We're not going anywhere. But then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised two men among them, قال رجلان مثنى, two men from among them, they said, قال رجلان من الذين يخافون أنعم الله عليهما ودخلوا عليهم الباب فإذا دخلتموه فإنكم غالبون وعلى الله فتوكلوا إن كنتم مؤمنين. So two men, we don't know their names, and the Quran did not mention their names, and we don't need to know their names, but it's mentioned with their characteristics. These are the real men. They said to their people, because they fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned again. So the more the person have the fear of Allah, the more that he is fulfilling what he's supposed to be as a man. أنعم الله عليهم, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed his favor upon them. They said to their people, ادخلوا عليهم الباب. Enter the gate on them. فإذا دخلتموه فإنكم غالبون. If you enter the gate, you will defeat them. And as we talked about that before, because this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered them to do. Go and fight your enemy. If you do that, Allah will give you victory. But they're cowards and they choose to be humiliated. So the two men, they said to them, ادخلوا عليهم الباب. This is in your capacity to enter the gate. What's beyond that, Allah knows best. But Allah commanded you. So put your trust in Allah. And as a result of that, when they did, they defeated their enemies. So again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned as two men. Musa alayhi salam, when the man came from Aqsa al-Medina, from the end part of the town, to warn Musa alayhi salam that the people are getting to kill him and to catch him. وجاء رجل من أقصى المدينة يسعى قال يا موسى إن الملأ يأتمرون بك ليقتلوك. A man came from Aqsa al-Medina, from the other side of town. يسعى, coming diligently to Musa alayhi salam, warning him that the mala, the elite, are planning to kill you. So leave. He came with the nasiha. So this is how the real men, they show in the time of a shidda, in the time of difficulties. You would find them there helping, and you would find them there not turning away from what is needed from them. And there are so many examples like this. Surah Yasin, the same thing. The man that came and he warned his people. And he warned them and to follow the mursaleen. And to follow the messengers of Allah, and how they killed them. And he said, Ya layta qawmi ya'lamun. When they killed him, he said, even after he died, I wish my people know, bima ghafara li rabbi, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgave me. Why? Because he still have the concern to his people. After they killed him and after he returned to Allah. And this is the meaning of it. That after they killed him, he still has the concern to his people. How can they save themselves from a shirk and the kufr that they were upon? So the like of that in the Quran are so many. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again wants from the believers. Some of the nusus, the hadith of Jundab ibn Abdullah, he said, كنا مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ونحن فتيان حزاورة. We were with the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام when we were fityan, young in age. And hazawira, that means we're close to the age of puberty, right there. So 14, 15, this is the age. They were with the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. فتعلمنا الإيمان قبل أن نتعلم القرآن. We learned al-Iman before we learned al-Quran. In that age, we learned al-Iman before we learned al-Quran. ثم تعلمنا القرآن فازددنا به إيمانا. Then we learned the Quran and it increased our Iman. And this is in Sunan al-Majah, and it's a sound hadith. We have the advices of Luqman to his son, and how he advised them with the same thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the men. One of the things that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam taught the companions radiallahu anhum, that the real character of an individual as being a man is the one that has, as we said, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with. Because many times a person is not responsible yet necessarily for his strength or physical strength, even though a person should do the best he can, that he's healthy and so on. But the Prophet ﷺ directs the Sahaba radiallahu anhum to what is more important in their life. There's the hadith of Sahl ibn Sa'd, and this is in Sahih Muslim, where he said, مَرَّ رَجُلٌ عَلَى رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. A man passed while the Prophet ﷺ is sitting with the companions radiallahu anhum. So the Prophet ﷺ said to the companions, teaching them, ما تقولون في هذا? What do you say about this man? So they said حري إن خطب أن ينكح. حري, that means it's more likely if he try to get engaged for marriage, and ينكح, that people will give him their daughters for marriage. وإن شفع أن يشفع, and if he intercede for a matter, his intercession will be granted. وإن قال أن يسمع, and if he say something, people would listen to him. That means he's a person of status, he's someone that people respect, someone that people would look up to. Then ثم سكت. The Prophet ﷺ did not say anything. فمر رجل من فقراء المسلمين. A man from the poor of the Muslims passed by. فقال ما تقولون في هذا? He said to them عليه الصلاة والسلام, what do you say about this man? قالوا حري إن خطب ألا ينكح. The opposite. That's more likely if he try to get married, he's not going to get married. Nobody wants to give their daughters for this poor man. وإن شفع ألا يشفع. And if he intercede, going to someone of status to intercede for someone, he says, who's this guy? So he's not going to granted the intercession. وإن قال ألا يسمع. And if he speak, nobody listens to him because he's a poor guy. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So the messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم said, هذا خير من ملء الأرض مثل هذا. This one, the latter one, the poor one, is better than the earth filled with the like of the other man. Not because he's poor, because otherwise this doesn't make sense. It's not because he's poor. So every poor person is better than every rich person. Every weak person is better than, physically better than a strong person. Of course, no one would ever say that. It's about the characteristics that this man was carrying. Someone from the believers, someone had the characteristics of the believers, and this is what matters. If this comes with wealth and strength, mashallah, favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon more favors. But this is where the foundation of things comes first. But most of the people, if they don't, what moves them is not the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, they would only judge it based on what physically they see and they hear. So the criteria of what's good and what's bad and what's a man versus the opposite and things like this, it becomes distorted unless a person get to know what's in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. That's why the early generations of Islam, they said many things about this subject. To have muru'ah or nobility, or to have a strong character as a man, some of them they said that al-himma nisf al-muru'ah, to have a high zeal, this is half of it. To have always high zeal, that a person doesn't want to be just anybody, but he wants to be the best. And this is in matters of dunya, worldly matters, people they understand that very well. But to be the best for the entire world, according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, this is basically what a person should seek, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. And that's why Umar radiallahu anhu, when it comes to the himma, to your ambitions in matters of deen specifically, and also matters of dunya as long as it's halal, but with the foundation of the deen, he said, لا تصغرن هممكم. Do not make your himma small. Do not make your ambitions very limited. He would say, oh, I'm not that good. So at least this, at least that. Matters of dunya, it's okay. A person to be content. Because it's all by the decree of Allah. But when it comes to matters of deen, and you would hear that even from young people, a person would say, I'm lazy. I can't come for the Salatul Fajr because I'm lazy. Sleep overpowers me. That sounds like a person that has strong determination, something silly like this. You know, people would not say the same thing when it comes to millions of dollars, for example. So do not make your himma, your zeal, something small. He says, radiallahu anhu, again mentioning men, he said, فَإِنِّي لَمْ أَرَ شَيْئًا أَقْعَدْ بِالرَّجُلِ مِنْ سُقُوطِ هِمَّتِهِ. He said, I've never seen something that would make a man sit down, meaning go down. He's not a man anymore. He does not fit that description from suqut himmati, when his himma, when his zeal falls down. So if he has no high zeal, that means this is the worst thing for a man. This is how they see things. A man, that means he has high ambitions to do things. And a person rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and take the means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained for him, and then with knowledge, with asking the people of knowledge and taking the means. And a person has to prepare himself that this is not necessarily going to be the norm among everybody, because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّمَا النَّاسُ كَإِبِلِ مِئَةٍ. The human beings, الناس, humankind, human beings are like the camels, 100 camels, لا تكاد تجد فيها راحلة. You would rarely find among 100 camels one rahila, one camel that you can ride over and be comfortable and take you places. So most of them are not. So this is how human beings are. So a person has to have that high zeal that he's preparing himself to be sometimes the only one. Let it be. If that's the case, then be the only one. Not arrogance, but actually it's with humbleness and knowing exactly how to be according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, not according to wishful thinking. And as we heard also the athar from Umar radiallahu anhu, when he said to the companions, each one of you have your own wish. Right? And this is something, one of the strange and amazing things in the life that we live in. Right? If we have the first thing that I start with, for example, get everybody, young and old, and without knowing what's the subject, and if we even in a context other than the masjid, so that everybody will be truthful. Or if we are truthful now, what truly we have as a wish, if you granted your wish. You know, if someone says to you, wish, and whatever you grant, whatever you wish, you will be granted for. Anything. And compare this to how the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to be. And their wishes were actually something that, for example, the Prophet ﷺ and his dua is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That means if they say it will happen to them. Like the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, when he brought the wudu to the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Sal, ask anything, and he left it open على الإطلاق هكذا, without a condition. Matters of dunya, matters of the hereafter. And this only concern that he had in his heart is أسألك مرافقتك في الجنة. O Prophet of Allah, I ask you to be your companion in Jannah. In Jannah. And this is when the ulama, they say, when you reflect upon this, if he asks this and something else, he can also get that something else. But you only, and he asked him عليه الصلاة والسلام, أو غير ذلك, anything else? He said, no, this is the only thing that I'm asking for. What kind of pure hearts they were upon. And how the Prophet ﷺ changed these hearts, that they would fight over a well of water or a camel or something like this, to have this high zeal that they changed the entire world because of this sincerity and this strong belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same thing with the companions radiallahu anhum, when Umar radiallahu anhu, so when, if we wish, what we will wish for. And that's why, as mentioned, and it's not to belittle anyone, it's the dunya, when it's the worldly matters, when it's into the hearts, the matters of goodness escape from it. Even reflecting upon the Quran, even benefiting from the book of Allah, the way it ought to be, it does not happen for someone that his heart is so much attached to this worldly life. And we're talking about hearts. You can be the richest man on the face of earth, but your heart is attached to the hereafter, attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The concern is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when someone, you would find people when they're asked, and that's what the 15-hour generation, and we have fault in this, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive our sins. But our young ones, from 15, 16, 17, 14, whatever, what is they would wish for the norm? What kind of car, what kind of wealth that they want to attain? Isn't that correct? And if you ask a 7 years old, he would say the same thing. And this is how the sad reality that we're facing. They're not changing. They're not developing the way that ought to be. They got taller, yes. Their voice changes. They might have some beard, and if they leave it, mashallah, so they have to leave it, right? But the hearts did not really grow that much. One at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, you would find someone like 16 years old, Usama ibn Zayd radiallahu an, leading an army with Abu Bakr and Umar in it. Right? And the ages of the Sahaba was amazing. And even from the Tabi'een and Tabi'een, Imam Malik, 21 years old. And he's given ijazah by, in some of the narrations, 70 of the ulama. They told him to sit and to give the fatwa. Right? What kind of upbringing this was. And the barakah and the blessings. And again, it's this is, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us. And it's not to blame them, but to blame ourselves. And that's why when someone, and we all do, when we complain, when it comes to our children, the first thing that should be done, as the ulama, they say, we need to repent to Allah. We need to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness And at-tawbah wadhifatul umr is the lifetime job for every believer. And to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the goodness is in the ummah, of course, definitely, for sure. But as we heard, they used to teach them what's the value of this life and what's there for here, what they are upon in this life, and how to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of which is to be upon the truth. One of the ways of being someone that is upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and one of the characteristics of men, to make sure that your religion, you get it from the authentic sources. Not to leave yourself to get religion from whatever comes along, whether it's young or old. Nowadays, anybody that says anything, this is religion, no, this is not the way. To be a man, get your religion from the authentic sources. And سَمُّوا لَنَا رِجَالَكُمْ, as Ibn Sirin rahimahullah, he says, name your men to us. Right? And إِنَّ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ دِينٌ فَانْظُرُوا عَمَّنْ تَأْخُذُونَ دِينَكُمْ, as he said. This matter is religion. So look who you are taking the religion from. And as Abdullah ibn Mubarak, he says, لَوْلَا الْإِسْنَادِ لَقَالَ مَنْ شَاءَ مَا شَاءَ. Al-Isnad min ad-Din. The chain of narrations is from the religion, meaning, where did you get this from? Where did you get that opinion from? Where did you get this belief from? It just happened that way? Because if it wasn't like this, anyone would say whatever they want. And one of the things that it shows, this morning we were reading from Sahih Muslim, I just mentioned this one narration from one of the sons of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhum. Ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhum. So the grandson of Umar ibn al-Khattab, one of the grandsons of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, as reported by Imam Muslim in his Muqaddimah, in his introduction. They asked him about something, matters of deen, and he said, Allahu a'lam, I do not know. فقال له يحيى ابن سعيد, one of the people, they said to him, والله إني لأعظم أن يكون مثلك وأنت ابن إمامي الهدى, يعني عمر وابن عمر, تسأل عن أمر ليس عندك فيه علم. It's great for me, it's something very heavy for me, that someone like you, and you are the son of the two imams of guidance, Abdullah ibn Umar and his father Umar ibn al-Khattab, and you're asked about a matter that you don't have knowledge of. This is difficult for me to take, right? When you're someone in that status. So then he said to him, and this is the real characteristics of men, the truthfulness, the sidq. They don't say about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without knowledge. They say, أعظم من ذلك. He said to them, أعظم من ذلك, greater than that. Wallahi, عند Allah, and by Allah, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and وعند من عقل, and the one that have reason, عن الله, those who understand from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala his deen, أن أقول بغير علم, which is much worse for me to say without knowledge, to say something without knowledge, أو أخبر عن غير ثقة, or I would inform from someone that is not ثقة. I would inform from someone that is not trustworthy, because this is matter of deen. And that's how a person should make sure that he's upon firm ground, that this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. This deen is based on wahy, nothing but wahy, revelation from Allah, not opinions and likings and taste of people and things like this. It's Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, the way it was understood and believed and acted upon in the time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and then the chain of the ulama, and this is what the ulama are upon. So to make sure that this, every matter of our religion, to the best of our ability, this is the job of the young and the old, to be real men, in which they would seek to make sure that matters of religion, they take it from authentic sources. They are making sure that this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, and is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to be upon this. So there are so many different things to remember here, but as it was mentioned that it is the job, and even though when we talk about manhood and being a man, and it's not what many people they might think it is, and it's just a call for each and every one of us to really look into and to learn the deen of Allah from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and to leave this laziness and this low zeal of things. When his heart is attached to this worldly matters, the concern in the morning and in the evening is how much money and how much this and how much that, when the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most important thing in our life. And it doesn't mean that a person doesn't seek provisions and work hard and things like that. Some of the Sahaba would, from after sunrise to sunset, they're working in the land and doing things. So there's nothing wrong with this. But the heart is about the sincerity of the deen of Allah, not committing sins, being steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also to raise our children, men as men and women as women. The boys are raised to be men and the girls are raised to be women, to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And really, and I hope this to be understood in the proper way, the problem in our communities and everywhere is the men. Men are the problem, not the women. If the real men, all the problems of women, inshallah, will be solved. But the problem is the lack of men that acquire these problems, and of course not to relieve the women from, of course, their faults. Every human being is responsible in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with their actions. And yes, there are men will be righteous and obedient to Allah and their women are not. This is how things are, and there's many examples in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. But the point here is when we fulfill our responsibilities, because part of being a man is that he has the qawama, he's in charge of his household. And at the same time, he is extremely kind to the women in his life. And this is the combination of two things that only men can achieve. A man, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the ability that he's in charge. He has the qawama. Qawama does not mean, what do they translate the word qawama in the watered down types of wordings? They say partnership, they say, no, qawama means men are in charge. They have the authority. If you are in a company, you have the entry-level worker and the CEO, they're all partners. You have a CEO and he gives a command and everybody has to follow, right? Otherwise, people will be fired, right? Men are in charge of their households, right? But of course, with that is what? استوصوا بالنساء خيرا. Be kind to your women. خيركم خيركم لأهلي وأنا خيركم لأهلي. The best among you are the best to his family, and I'm the best to my family. The Prophet ﷺ ordering, لا تقبح, do not say any word that would make, whether the verbal abuse, any word bad to your wife. This is against being a man. Being extremely kind, and at the same time, you are responsible for this household. If these two things are together, and we have in the Prophet ﷺ the best example. His hand never touched a woman beating a woman or saying a bad word to them, and being at ease with them, to the extent of which that they would see as if they are the ones in charge, right? So who's the one that has this ability, who's the one that has been given that responsibility, are men. And this is how a person should seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he has this balance in which he is extremely kind and at the same time he's the one that is responsible. And as the example, if a man and a woman, a lion comes and he wants to attack them, what a real man would do when he has his wife with him, he would run and leave her. If she runs, that's understood, right? But what a man would do, he would even put himself in harm's way to protect his wife, right? This is what a real man would do. So the point here is, it's not about favoring one or the other, because everyone, if they are believers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are the same when it comes to their responsibility of actions. They all enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're responsible for their actions. But the point here is having the characteristics that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made unique for them versus one another, and to be obedient to Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change our situation, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from the evil within our own selves and to make it easy for all of us, inshallah. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. جزاكم الله خير.